So good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to be here. I'm Liz Grassi, and I manage the Climate Change Research Program for the Strategic Growth Council. The program was established in 2017 by legislature and provided about $34 million in research grant funding. Really focused on science to action, engaging both researchers and community partners in all phases of the research process. We really wanted to ensure tangible research outcomes that advance implementation of our climate goals as a state, but also a focus on equity and development goals. So from the outcome of this program, which ended in 2020, was that we created the participatory research to policy model, which is the community engagement model. And really is thinking about a collaborative partnership approach to research that equitably involves community members, organizational representatives, and researchers in all aspects, again, of research. We really see this as a paradigm shift that allows partners the opportunity to contribute their expertise and share responsibility and ownership to increase the understanding of a given phenomenon and to incorporate the knowledge gained with action that enhances healthy communities. So with that, we had a little bit of money left over at the end, and so we decided to use it to kind of create some partnerships, and including with CSU-WATER, to really elevate the importance of this whole research paradigm and the ongoing need for capacity, tools, and coordination. So we're really pleased to be able to fund this project in particular in a creative way. And we look forward to the results we'll hear from today. So thank you all for all of your hard work, and you have a friend in us. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Um, yeah, so Gavin, if you want to spend a couple minutes on EPIC, and just to let everybody know, EPIC has worked, nationally and internationally to make these happen. And we had many a discussion with both Gavin and Ada about different ways we could approach this before we started engaging people statewide. So, Gavin, you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'm actually going to ask Ada if you could share your screen, and then I think we have Ada up first. But just wanted to say thank you so much to SGC for bringing us in and working with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ada Inman. I am the Communications and Program Manager for EPIC N. Thank you all for inviting us to do a really short presentation here. Gavin is the Managing Director for EPIC N. I'm going to turn it over to him shortly, but I wanted to give you just a brief overview of who we are at the network. So getting started, the EPIC network is a network of programs who are mostly located within universities who partner with local communities to address community-identified challenges through student coursework. So what does that look like? Basically, what happens is a community comes up with a list of projects that they need help addressing. Someone at the university, who we usually call a program manager, takes that list of projects and matches it to faculty or multiple faculty in the university who are already teaching courses around those project topic areas. Then through that, the faculty incorporate the community project into their syllabus, and the students work on the project throughout their course and provide a deliverable to the community at the end of the semester. So that is just the gist of how these partnerships work. All of the programs in the network follow what we call the EPIC model, which is what you see here on the screen. So I just want to briefly run through the 5 tenets of the model with you all. The first tenet is respecting existing administrative structures and individual responsibilities and incentives on all sides. This basically means we aren't trying to readjust the course structure at the university. We're using existing resources, existing student courses, and existing projects from the community. We also want to create a genuine partnership with local governments, meaning that they have a seat at the table throughout the whole project. Anyone in the community who wants to have a voice on the project is welcome to contribute, and students consult with the community partner throughout the whole project duration. We also intentionally aim at improving quality of life. All of our projects are evaluated based on the UN SDGs. We just want to make sure these projects are focused on improving quality of life and not taking any quality of life away. We also focus on community identified driven and evaluation contributions, meaning that all of the projects are community identified instead of universities coming to the community saying we want to work on this. It's the opposite. We also evaluate all community members after the project ends to make sure that they had a good experience and to learn what we need to do differently moving forward. Lastly, we want to catalyze as many disciplines and numbers as possible. This is a really scalable approach. It's very transdisciplinary. Many projects involve multiple different courses across the campus, and we can address multiple projects from the communities during this partnership. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gavin.
Yeah, and Chris had alluded to the fact that we are an international network. So I did want to make sure that we covered the fact that we do have affiliates in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. Of course, we got started in the United States, so that's where a bulk of our programs are, but we have a fairly wide network of people across the world subscribing to the EPIC model. We have about 100 member universities, several in California. CSU-WATER is one of our affiliates, of course, CSU Monterey Bay, UC San Diego are just a couple of the programs that we have in California. We've also been talking with like Sacramento State, for instance, and getting more involved, and Chico to get them more involved. So we'd love to have any universities who are interested in this work to join us. And we just wanted to say we think it's really easy to join our network. It's scalable. It is cheap. We don't cost anything. You don't have to subscribe or pay your membership fee. You join a community of people. You have broader reach across your entire university, and we offer an international angle. And I think these are just a few things to say. I really feel like what we are doing is helping build a movement of universities who are trying to be outward facing, externally facing. I know research agenda is a word that gets thrown around a lot in academic circles. We are trying not to have agendas when we go to communities and we say, we have something that we can offer. What is it that you need help with? And that's really the company that you'd be in if you were in EPIC, in the EPIC company. So thanks a lot to Steve for pulling us in. Thanks, Chris, for consulting with us. And with that, we will hand it over to you all to get the program really underway. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aaliyah.
Hi, everyone.
And you can tell me when next slide. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. So I'm going to quickly introduce our team for this project. So if Chris, you could move on. I want to first start off with Dr. Steve Blumenshine, who's the director of CSU-WATER, which is a CSU-wide affinity group where they work to get the CSU system involved in water issues across the state. We have Jessica Bremner, who's an assistant professor of urban geography at CSU-LA and an urban planner in practice, who is our faculty expert on this project. And then we have Chris Halley and Claudia Luke from the Center for Environmental Inquiry. Claudia is the director of this center with years of experience running field stations, and Chris has been in industry for many years and serves as an interface between communities and the university. And then my name's Aaliyah. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara who's graduating with a BA in environmental studies and political science, and with more specifically an interest in environmental policy and working toward sustainable communities. Awesome. Oh, and then we also have Jace, who is our project manager for this project at CSU-WATER. Just to briefly go over our project objectives and framework, academic institutions and researchers have a lot to offer communities, but they can be disconnected. And the main theme of this project is we aim to look at how we could really break down those barriers from universities and the communities, and how we could really achieve action in communities and not just research, similar to what Liz was touching on and Chris. As well. So it's really about bridging the gap between the two in a way that is sustainable and also long-term. And our mission was to just identify the barriers within the process and compose recommendations to strengthen the process of community-engaged research, which allows that type of mending of the two worlds to be possible. There's an urgent need to find and implement new solutions that benefit California communities, but the research results can take decades to implement. So our main two, questions in this project are how can academics, NGOs, and agencies work together to effectively move research results into practice? So, like I said, touching on more than just the research, but how can we actually bridge the two? And then also, how can granting agencies ensure that research funding will result in meaningful community outcomes? So, to briefly go over our project objectives, which is also kind of the agenda for this presentation. Thank you, Gavin, for going over Epic Network in general. So our project has gone through many phases, but we have an extremely valuable partnership with Epic N, which I'll get to kind of later. But we have worked towards identifying best practices for engaging communities in research. And we've gathered case studies and expert opinions through a series of interviews from many across the state, working towards pushing action in communities in various ways. And they've given us great insight on tools and resources available and limitations that they face and stories from successful institutes, which we've then used to create a survey. And we expanded the scope of our project by creating that survey, which has been extremely helpful in our work. And we'll be going over those insights from the survey later in this presentation. Ada and Gavin explained it very well, obviously, but yeah, they serve to kind of create those collaborations between, academia and then government or communities and really drive actionable research. And the Epic Network model described by Ada, serves as an excellent point to understand the complicated world of the two and how they could collaborate. And yeah, they've been trying to do very similar things, similar to SGC, and they've had many success stories working with communities. For example, we just have one in here with Peoria in Arizona with help from ASU students, which we looked at more closely in this project, and they have plenty more success stories on their website. Yeah, so Epic Network has established tools used for this type of work that are separated into pre-award, award, and post-award in terms of grant management. The main tools it's championed for use by researchers include, like Ada mentioned, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and then also the Ripple Effects Mapper and Government Performance Action and Learning, or the GPAL, is something that we also took a look at. Those are all pre- and post-award tools. The Ripple Effects Mapping and GPAL aim to kind of take snapshots of the community to provide baseline evaluations and to summarize collaboration effectiveness. And they also provide virtual training in those seeking to collaborate and evaluate proposals. And overall, we just really think the state should take advantage of the work of Epic Network, as they have a lot to offer in engaging institutions with communities. Aside from Epic Network, in the project, we also identified additional tools that are available to strengthen this type of research and bridge that gap between institutions and the community. There's a few here, but one that we'll mention real quick is the self-assessment rubric for the institutionalization of service learning. We think it would be a very useful tool for SGC to encourage every California institution to take. The whole point of this is it assesses 5 key dimensions, that being philosophy and mission, faculty support, student involvement, community partnerships, and institutional infrastructure. And each of these dimensions kind of highlight critical components like faculty incentives, sustainable community relationships, and like student involvement, and just the dedicated support structures for these processes. And by evaluating these areas, institutions can really identify the gaps and develop improvement strategies and promote service learning as like a central and sustained element of their academic mission and community engagement efforts. There's other tools in this that are used throughout the state that we looked at that would be served by better coordination and mentoring from granting institutions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris to discuss case studies. Thank you, guys.
So thank you for that, Aaliyah. And so like Aaliyah mentioned, we did a number of interviews across the state. And so in this part of the presentation, I'll just be focusing on 3 case studies pretty quickly, and then a series of lessons learned. And so the case studies are from practitioners of community engaged research. And so the first one is our very own education into action model that we practice here at Sonoma State. And it's really about marrying 2 cultures to help find solutions. So we at SSU are kind of the interface between faculty and students wanting to make a difference, and between NGOs and government agencies and industry who are trying to make a difference on the ground. And we do that a couple of ways. One is we have people in the organization that have worked in both academia and industry, and so they know the best and worst, I guess, of both worlds. And we use a steering committee. And so much like Gavin and Ada were saying, the steering committee we recruit for each particular collaboration is drawn from the community experts, and people that are trying to make a real difference within the community. And so our goal is to really get undergraduates mainly working on these issues, and students of all disciplines making a difference. And so often when you start to look at what the community would like, there are a lot of complex issues that all intersect. So for example, one of our collaborations is studying issues involved at the intersection of homelessness and water quality. And homeless folks live in riparian areas and can influence water quality, but water quality and where homeless folks are allowed to go influence the quality of the homeless life. And so when you start pulling on these threads, it gets very complicated, or very wicked, as the new terminology is. And one advantage to this model, the steering committee model, is that very often this is the only time some of these groups ever meet and talk to each other. So that in itself is valuable. And then you learn lessons that can be applicable statewide, but you also learn things that are applicable locally. You might learn that Joe in the planning department absolutely hates your topic. So in order to advance the cause of your topic, you might have to go talk to Ray in the emergency services department. And so you learn a suite of lessons learned, which is very valuable for the community and the students. And you also slowly move the needle on action. And that's really what our focus is to slowly move the needle on these really wicked problems that have taken decades to form. Just as an example, this is one of our collaborations, the steering committee about homelessness and water quality. And we have, water agency folks involved in it, homeless coordinators, environmental services coordinators, and even homeless advocates, all trying to look at a piece of this particular issue. And one thing that sort of gets my back up a little bit is the use of research in some of these, calls for proposals or applications, because as a scientist, for me, that has a specific meaning, but social and legal roadblocks are every bit as worthy of study and action as basic scientific research. And so we're really trying to create action, whatever that means. And so having philosophy and psychology and political science and business students involved in a study like this can be very valuable, because that can actually be where all the roadblocks are in a community. The second case study, the second model I'd like to mention is the Latino Policy and Politics Institute down in Los Angeles. And this is my poor graph of what they actually do. And they focus on issues of urgency to Latino policymakers. And so their main focus is a little bit different. They have an annual call for proposals, and they also have short turnaround items. And typically they might award, say, $25,000 to a faculty member and a graduate student to work on an issue and to frame some legislative language to actually make change at the local and state level for issues that affect the Latino community. And so it's very focused on that particular group, but of course it does affect everybody. And their focus on making change politically and with graduate students and faculty is another way of maintaining expertise and then training this sort of higher level expertise to try to affect the halls of power. And they are very good. These are snapshots from their website, but they are very good at making their data available through the Latino Data Hub that's got all of their projects and all of their findings. They focus on helping to build entrepreneurs throughout LA and throughout the United States. And they also focus on the Futures Lab, and that's getting more Latino women involved in entrepreneurship and halls of power in order to make a difference for all Californians. And so you've got one model, which is undergrad, lots of students, one model, which is sort of more expertise in making legislative change. And then the third model I'd like to point out is from Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, and this is up near Chico State, and this is a natural preserve land used mainly for research and education. And the preserve, this arrow on the left is time from years ago to the present day. And the preserve initially hired a cultural steward to work with the local tribes to try to understand the tribes, try to understand the issues, try to establish trust. And they hired it on their own dime, right? So the tribes weren't asked to contribute. And this is important because tribes often don't have the time or the expertise to contribute to proposals to make a difference. And so the cultural steward started working with the tribes to help govern how they did cultural burning on the preserved land, what projects they allowed on the land. They eventually gave some land back to the tribes. That was significant. And then Chico State noticed what was happening, and they hired additional people. So they went out and hired a tribal engagement manager and a tribal engagement coordinator. And today, the tribes actually participate in key institutional decisions, right? So they have a say in the direction of the university and in who the president's going to be and the direction the provost is going to establish. And the lesson here is that building that capacity came from within the university, and now it benefits both the university and the local tribes. So that was really quick, 3 different models. And I'll go through a few of the lessons learned, and I think everybody should recognize that painting. But the first lesson learned is that developing and maintaining these relationships takes time. And just as an example, our rising waters timeline, we ended up studying homelessness and water quality, but in fall 2018, we started having discussions with our partners about what topic we should explore next. And we had a series of workshops, we refined the questions, we had more workshops. And it wasn't until the fall of 2020 that we actually awarded faculty student research grants. That was 2 years. And we award $10K per faculty student team. And we already had these relationships in place. And so shepherding these is really where a lot of this change can come from. This is a little tongue-in-cheek, but prioritize the relationship. A lot of faculty and students don't have training in teamwork, what that looks like, or strategic planning. And so I tend to throw the house on Pooh corner at them and talk about the different animals and who they are. And so rabbit likes to go around and do things. And people say, yes, rabbit, and no rabbit. And that works really well in industry, but it doesn't work so well in academia where you talk about things, or in the government world where there's rules and regulations. And so learning who's on your team and how to prioritize them and how to work with them is very important. And one of the lessons I draw from the book is that the community is important, the relationship's important. And if you focus on that, the project will eventually get done. But if you just try to push through the project no matter what, you can actually destroy the relationship. And I've got some stories about that later if people are interested. Faculty and students need support, right? There's all different kinds of community members out there, and you need to write reports that can address all their needs. The reports need to be actionable. Just saying, we found this correlation isn't good enough. You have to direct people as to what to do on the ground. So that's one way they need support. And then again, the newer faculty relate to this, but applied research is every bit as difficult and important as basic research. And And that's really an institutional focus. You know, we have this myth that research is the end all and be all with universities, and that may not always be true. And this, I'll speak for myself here, but proposal evaluation can be a serious issue. I don't really have permission to share other people's stories in this regard, but this figure represents the two networks of field stations we have in California. We have the two largest networks of preserves and field stations in the world. And it's from a proposal we wrote for the Climate Action Seed Grants. And one thing we've learned and other people learned is when you're doing have new approaches, you're doing new things, the innovation may not often be rewarded. So for example, you can have a couple of reviewers on the grant that think you're doing wonderfully, you've met all the granting requirements, and it just takes one bad review of somebody saying, this really doesn't move the science, and trashing your proposal to have you knocked out of the running. And so there are ways around that to overcome those cultural barriers. And I would be happy to talk about those a little bit in the question and answer session. So I'm gonna conclude with a couple of, I've only got a couple more slides here. I'm gonna conclude with a couple of questions. And in this area of community engaged research, I really don't know what is considered success. You know, and this is a map of Italy, and it shows the locations of centers that can distribute food and supplies in case of an earthquake or a natural disaster. And we wanted to adopt this program for Sonoma County, and we wanted to show where the showers and water fountains and homeless services are. And all of our stakeholders wanted us to do this too. So where do you cut off your work? So it's not enough to gather data or identify a solution. We did that. You get buy-in from your steering committee, from all the community partners, from all the county agencies. And then nobody wants to sign on the dotted line for the free computer license that would allow this project to happen. Everybody starts fighting. And so you keep going, you find the county department that's interested in implementing the solution. And then because of some kind of weird politics, for example, within the county, various departments are arguing with each other. If it gets stuck, do you walk away, or do you then hire student teams to make the case and start going to Board of Supervisors meetings and say, look, the entire county wants this and it's getting stuck in politics. Where do you cut that off, and where do you say enough is enough? So what success is really fuzzy in my mind sometimes. So that's an open question I'd be happy to hear input from people on. And then the other question that's come up for us is, how do we effectively engage communication students? You know, some of these issues are real hot button topics, and you've got community members on the left, for want of a better term, thinking they know what solutions are, and community members on the right thinking they know what solutions are. And city council meetings, we've had people shouting at each other instead of talking and listening. And, you know, so we've had some of our communication students start developing education or public media or story campaign videos for city councils and Board of Supervisors to play, just to sort of de-escalate tensions before these discussions even begin. But I think there's more to do there to allow nuance to re-enter our discussions on some of these complicated issues. And again, I'd be happy to talk about or hear comments from people about how to do that. So anyway, that was a bit of a fire hose. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica and our survey.
So next slide, Chris.
Sorry.
As we were getting these really rich findings from the case studies and the toolbox and the interviews, we realized that we wanted to complement that with a broader understanding of what we were finding with our community of community engaged researchers. We know that here in California, and as Gavin showed, right, internationally, community engaged research is quite prolific. We also know that it's being funded at levels that we haven't seen in the past. And so we worked with SGC to actually expand our scope a bit by implementing a survey to researchers that used a community engaged research approach on one or more of their projects. And we wanted to do this to really create some broad findings. And we used both our findings from the interviews and case studies, as well as the literature, to structure our survey questions. So we reached out to researchers across California, including UC and CSU campuses and field stations, and then nationally through the EPIC-N and OBFS. So if you can go to the next slide, Chris. We had 55 respondents complete the survey, and 87 who started from across the US, but as you can see, the majority came from California. Out of that, out of the 55, we had 5 that were non-university, 4 of which were nonprofit researchers. 54% of respondents from universities were from teaching universities, and 70% of respondents from universities were tenure track faculty. So the other 30% were non-tenure track or research center or other researchers at the universities. So I'm going to go through a few of our specific questions, and then I will talk about some of our preliminary kind of general findings. And I just want to note that these are preliminary findings, and one of the purposes of this webinar is to be able to discuss these findings with you, get questions, get feedback as a way to really incorporate your thoughts into our final kind of research and report. So this slide shows the results of a question that we posed to researchers about their primary motivations for doing community engaged research. And we found that really the majority of respondents noted that their motivations were either related to ethics of research, so ethics towards community, or ethics in terms of place, or as really the outcomes of research. So outcomes of the research itself or outcomes for the community in terms of being action oriented. And the majority of those that responded with ethics or research actually selected both. So they were selecting as a motivation, both ethics and outcomes for the most part. And we plan to kind of further analyze this in relation to research categories and some of our other questions that we had. So in this next question, we asked, we found, right, some limitations. Chris presented those on the case studies. And so we wanted to understand if other researchers were kind of encountering the same limitations in implementing community-based research. And as you can see, the majority of respondents, right, we have 42 respondents said that lack of funding was one of their larger limitations, as well as administrative support. And so this really supports some of the findings that we had in the case studies themselves. So we asked respondents to discuss who most frequently initiates community research partnerships. So whether this was researcher initiated, community initiated, a collaboration. And as you can see here, the majority of projects were either researcher initiated or researcher and community initiated collaborations. So I think this is just to note that there is a kind of equal, right, between researcher and community collaborations as initiators of research projects. So in terms of initiation, we wanted to understand how funders' requirements for community engaged projects were affecting the initiation of community engaged projects. And so we asked respondents whether or not a funder's requirement for community engagement initiated their outreach to a community. And then we also asked whether they had an established relationship with a community partner prior to applying for specific funding. And we found that the majority of respondents that are initiating community engaged research we found the majority of respondents initiated community engaged research prior to and not because of any funder requirement, right? So we have 42 that did not initiate because of the funder's requirement. And we also found that the majority, regardless of whether the community outreach was initiated because of the funder, the majority of respondents had an established relationship with the community that they were working on for that research prior to a funding application. This is the last kind of question that I'll go over before getting into some kind of larger findings. But so this last question, we asked how the community was involved in different parts of the research. So on the left side of the table, so on the y-axis, we have the different parts of a research process. And you can see on the x-axis, we asked a lot of X's in there. We asked how the community was involved in each of those processes. And so what we found, right, was this wide array of community involvement throughout the research process. Some really interesting findings from this, right, is that at the developing research question stage is where we found that the majority of community involvement as a co-creator or consulted was found. And overall, we found that researchers were engaging with communities either as a co-creator or in consulting. What's really interesting about community and researchers co-creating developing research questions is that this actually really points to some of the literature that argues that it's very important for communities to be involved in the research process at the very beginning for research outcomes to be most successful. And so we're seeing that out of our survey respondents, they are also kind of engaging at that level. We also found 3 areas where community researchers were co-creators. So outside of developing a research question, we also saw that during the data collection and the implementation of research findings is where community was involved in the co-creator as a co-creator. And there were few areas where the community was a sole creator of the research process. And we can dig into this a little bit more if folks would like. So some of our initial kind of general findings corroborates what we have found in both the literature and in our case studies and interviews. So a lack of institutional support really seems to be the most common limitation in terms of financial support, but also administrative support. So this could be encouragement from institutions, a lack of student preparation for this type of research, or just a difference in timing and calendars of the relationship building process versus the academic schedule. And similarly with timelines between kind of academic schedule and funding resources to maintain relationships outside of funded research. So we also found that students are almost always involved in community engaged research projects from our respondents. So not only are these projects community engaged, but they're student engaged. And so I think that's just to really point out the importance of community engaged projects for student learning at the university level. We found that, and I think this also is something that goes to what Chris was saying earlier, that respondents aren't doing community engaged research in just a one-off project. These are projects that are long-term, that are with long-standing relationships with communities. So it really points to this importance of relationships that Chris talked about earlier. We found that, you know, community engaged research is very diverse, and there are pros and cons to this, as this quote that we put up from one of our respondents notes. So not only is it diverse in how the community is involved, as I showed earlier, but it's also diverse in how the community is defined. So this is really from stakeholders that are interested in the same issue, to a very place-based community, to a community that's defined by age or health, or even we got respondents that discussed how a community was with the more than human and with ancestors. And so this has a lot of implications, not only for how we talk about community engaged research, and to Chris's earlier point about what success is for community engaged research, but it also has implications in terms of funding and support. And I will pass it on to Steve to wrap it up for us.
Thanks, Jessica. I think everyone could see there, we chose some touch points that encapsulated the whole of our survey responses. We just kind of skimmed the surface there. But overall, we thought there are a lot of hopeful patterns. There's people willing to do community engaged research for the right ethical reasons, to connect with communities and work with them, not over them in their goals, and also to include students in our CSU-WATER world, not just in community-based research, but we call that our golden triangle, when you have faculty, communities, and students working towards common goals. So it's good to see this in this space, and we see this in water and energy spaces as well. So where do we go from here? We worked with some of the university centers for community engagement, and we want to work with them and inform them about our findings and how that could guide and create a consistent framework for their engagement of communities and marrying them with faculty researchers and their students to promote this kind of work, especially under the participatory action framework that SGC has featured. And so we want to also promote this work in our final report, which will be upcoming, to produce some best practices fundraising and how to be a good partner. And then we of course would share that on our CSU-WATER website. And then Gavin and Ada, we want to see how we could best disseminate that. Maybe do a webinar during one of the monthly EPIC meetings, for example. And then also work with SGC to get back to the heart of the project, like Liz Grassi presented how this project came about, to look at effective application and organization of statewide resources. You know, many of us who work in California, we don't often see the best coordination among state agencies when they actually have some overlapping missions. So maybe we could tie up some of those loose ends for greater benefit, for example. And then also, what's next? I think the genesis of this project was really to produce some results and to be able to discuss with SGC the tailoring and customization. Yeah, thanks, Lisa Bueller. That's great offer there. To advise their funding programs. So in other words, how do they ensure that their dollars for funding academic researchers are going to have really impacts? That's where this project can draw some touch points and resources to ensure that in the application and proposal review process. So we're going to get back to those who helped us disseminate the survey and let the responders know what others think, what their other colleagues think who do this kind of research. And then in some example applications, we're working with the Delta Stewardship Council and their Science for Communities program. I participated in 2 cycles of that. And Chris, I talked with you recently in getting your center involved in this. And how this works, everybody, is that communities nominate projects to the Delta Stewardship Council to be included in their Science for Communities program. What the Delta Stewardship Council does is to find experts, let's say on mercury in water and in fish, to produce advisories for tribal communities, advising against maybe certain levels of fish consumption, for example, which are really important culturally for those communities. And so they received more bids for community projects than they could manage. And so we're going to have an agreement where CSU-WATER pilots some of those nominated projects, and we could work with Chris and the people at Center for Environmental Inquiry on that, I think. And then Epic Network, I want to stay in touch with you guys on these as well for some input and feedback. And then also, we're already doing some work in the space in CSU-WATER and our colleagues working with small farms and farmers who are economically imperiled with their existence, and they're challenged by water regulations and some policies, and they really need some help and outreach for their survival, basically. So some of these community engaged practices could be helpful there. And then also work with resource conservation districts on water and other environmental issues. I mean, I think back through history, there's been a lot of engagement with research conservation districts, which marry science and public and on the ground needs very effectively, we find. And so for those of you who may not be aware of it, there's a California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, which is a very great group, well organized, and they are a hub for the 93 RCDs throughout California. So next, I think, is closing it up a bit. Chris, we got another slide in there. Looks
That's
like we
it.
might have a little time for Q&A, remarkably. We got a lot of info there, everybody.
Yeah. So any questions, anybody? That was a fire hose.
Thanks for taking my question. You didn't even put my picture up there. Hey, I just noticed that a lot of your recommendations were directed at universities. And I think it's a two-way street in some of our community partnerships. And I just wanted to find out if you had any responses with regards to what it looked, what does a good partnership look like on the community end?
So I'll take it and then Steve can follow up, I guess. So offline, we focused mainly on academics for this one, trying to break down that barrier. Offline, I've talked to some of our partners about what that looks like, but I think that's a follow-up, kind of a follow-up piece is from the partner end, what they think their responsibilities are versus what we are. And so, I don't know, and Steve, in my head, I'm imagining creating a cookbook, like kind of thing is here's how to be a good partner, here's how to engage. And again, here's how to tie into some of the Epic End resources that outline some of what a partner's responsibilities might be. So I think that's a great question, and that's definitely a follow-up part of this study. Yeah, Steve, you want to chime in a little bit, or?
Yeah, I think also I've been on a few events that featured the community partners were the panels, not the faculty researchers, which is really refreshing. And many of them were willing to talk to us and engage about this project. So I think we need another, funded piece, kind of a phase 2, focusing on the communities themselves and not the researchers, which is what we did in phase 1 for the most part.
Lisa, you have your hand up?
How about now?
Yes.
Very good, thanks. I see Sue has her hand up as well. We're here on the call for the same reason. We actually are looking at engaging in a research project to look at governance, the community, and actual access into those systems and what constitutes a successful engagement of the community into governance. And our thought was that there probably was an opportunity to somehow partner, or even we'd probably be willing to pilot to do this. And that we're doing that with Sue from SHE. So Sue, I'll go ahead and stop talking and let you hop in and tell them a little bit more about what you're trying to do. But we're kind of curious about how all of this might be married, particularly if you're interested right now in looking at the community side of it.
Yeah.
And we're fiddling around with a couple of different things. I have some concepts that we're playing around with. For the others that are on the phone, I'm the former associate director from the Center of Collaborative Policy at Sacramento State, and get to sometimes hang out with Steve for various and sundry reasons. And we've done a little bit of governance work. So that's kind of how I am very grateful to be invited to this conversation. So Sue, do you want to hop in?
Sure. And I am thankful that Lisa invited me. Hi, Laura and Chase. I work with you on other work. I live in Easton, which is just outside Fresno, in a small rural community, CSU, Fresno graduate, education. That's my background. And I work at Self-Help Enterprises. I've been there about 13, 14 years. And if you're not familiar, they do housing and a bunch of other stuff. But I'm engaged in really passionate and trying to figure out how to more effectively truly have community voices engaged in all these, in our case, water decision-making places. And self-help is supposed to be one of the best in outreach and community engagement, so on and so forth. And yet we can do better. We just need to do better, you know. And so we have a lot of relationships with communities up and down the valley. We serve 9 counties. And I just started this, what I call Leadership Institute, and got it back again a few years ago. And I'm trying to do it different. And what we keep hearing from our community folks, we've been able to work with UC Merced, and maybe some things with UCLA. We got some stuff coming with UC Davis. And I've got another project with UC Berkeley that I'm kind of inherited that it's not water, it's other stuff. We're hearing from our community folks when we took them all to UC Merced and went to the vernal pools and saw the stuff that the students are doing. They were like, how do we get this information to our community people? You know, so they can be informed. So we're creating some coursework where they can actually get knowledge. But there is a desire to have the academic mindset and academic processes brought into community participation. And there's a need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Sue. We're good friends with Eddie Ocampo and Jesse Snyder. I know you're a large operation, but I'm gonna, and Lisa, we could talk to you more maybe next week at Aqua, but I guess have an email queued up to you already about some things we could connect on. And there's ways for faculty to connect with the communities better. As a faculty member, I was involved for about 10 years with a model called service learning. And that's where students, usually seniors, do their projects with a community group or an agency, for example. It gets them out of the academic bubble, so to speak. And a good number of those students landed jobs, you know, after they graduated and through that engagement. It was just a great connector of communities, students, and then academic structures.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to be a little responsive to what Claudia had said too. Just, you know, there needs to be that full triangle of activity happening.
The golden triangle, we heard it called. Yes.
Hey, Gavin, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, as much as the community is really, really important here, I also feel like there's a lot of work that like universities have to do in order to get themselves ready to actually hear what communities have to say. Because everything about academic training is about you are the expert, you define the research agenda. You work not in collaboration, you work on your own often, because you have to be the one getting tenure. And if you're not doing it yourself, then how can we tell that your work is quality? Notice that in the graph that Aaliyah showed, no one is doing this work for promotion and tenure.
Yep, that's a big
But yet that's what faculty care about. They care about getting tenure and promotion.
Yeah. How about that result?
That does not show up as a motivation for doing this work. I think they're doing it in spite of the system as opposed to because of the system. So this is why I'm saying I think we need to be creating a movement to figure out how can we at the university be more open to having different knowledges and ways of knowing and perspectives, and how are you trained as a faculty member and all this kind of stuff. I found kind of the irony that a lot of people who write about community engagement, I'm not calling anyone out, but like the people who write about community engagement sometimes are like the worst at it. They're really good at studying it, but they're not as great as like actually getting in and diving in and being like, I'm just going to be quiet and listen. So I say that with all due respect, because I work in and with universities. Like I know the potential when it works so well. But like, we just need to figure out how to get more people on board with that movement, and figure that out. The only other thing that I was going to mention, Steve, and Chris and Aaliyah, is thinking about ways to maybe engage people like AAC&U or the American Association of University Professors to try to do like a larger sample size of like faculty who may not really be in the world of community engagement, but still, how do they think about their research? Are they looking at working with external partners and all that kind of stuff? Just thinking about ways to maybe scale this to a professional association that has the ears and eyes of a lot of different professors at all different kinds of institutions. That's the only other suggestion.
No, I think that's really great. And I think that I'll just make a comment and then I'll go to you, Claudia. But I think that getting faculty out in the real world and making them realize that this is actually hard, and it might even be harder than their own area of expertise, is really interesting. And your comment about changing the culture was interesting because it reminded me, a lot of academics, of course, I'm a bleeding heart liberal, a lot of academia is liberal, but often some of the preconceptions that come with that can actually be wrong when you're looking at a situation. And so it reminds me of my teamwork building slide. So I was giving a presentation to, this goes for the community as well. I was giving a presentation to a North Bay watershed associations, and there were 9 of them there. And afterward, one person who was clearly a conservative asked a question, and I lapsed into problem solving mode, where I thought, I wonder if he has a point. And so I checked out for about 15 seconds and I was doing the multidimensional thing in my head. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I went to come back. And by the time I came back, everybody else in the room had dogpiled this guy and told him to shut up and he was an idiot. Right. And he was volunteering for his own watershed association. And I thought, actually, no, this guy's right. His crime was being a conservative. And so I think making sure in academia and the community that all those viewpoints are heard and that the world's more complicated than all of us know is a real lesson I found myself having to bring more and more to myself and to other people. So anyway, Claudia.
So I know the impetus for this particular study is surrounding how can we fund projects that are going to result in implementation. And some of the real key things that you've come up with is, one, it's a really long process. And also, I have multiple ones, but the ones that come in mind right now. And then the structure we've been talking about within academia. So, how can we use that leverage of a funding agency to try to help with this process? I know that's something that we talked about way at the beginning of the project, but it's such a unique opportunity to be able to provide these kinds of recommendations surrounding that process. I'm just wondering, I'm sure you've had many conversations about that.
Yeah, I'll take a swing unless somebody else wants to, but I'll go and then Steve and Jessica jump in, I guess. I'm completely biased in this regard, and I sort of admit it, but our case studies and a lot of the people we've talked to have made the point that 2 things. One, funding people to maintain the relationship is what fuels the projects and what fuels the results. So, proposals for one-off projects are okay, but that's not what's going to keep it going long-term. That's a start and stop thing. You need the flywheel going. And in fact, one of our interviewees at Cal Poly, he and his colleagues wrote a letter to the California State Legislature saying, fund one person at every university at least to maintain these relationships, because not only you get it going long-term, you can then, once you start producing results, use the local folks and the local RCDs to try to entrain more funding. And so that's one answer to that. The other answer is there are ways to revise a proposal process that maybe focus on the relationships instead of the single one-off projects. But I don't know. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? It sort of depends.
Chris, I was about to type in the chat, but I'll just say really quickly, I do think
Right.
it would be great if SGC could maybe work with other funders to put requirements in the grant that say like,
Right.
your department will be supportive of your work and this will be counted in their tenure and promotion process or something
That's
like
right.
that. I know that
That's right.
anytime you start to get into that, you also start to like, well, it's not academic freedom and like, how are we going to judge the quality of this, stuff? But I wonder if there might be some people at SGC that might try to get other funders to start to
Right.
encourage universities to have structural reforms that go along with these kind of one-off, so to speak, community engaged research projects.
That's a great, yeah, I've been involved in personnel things at academic level, and that's a real bear trap. You got to watch where you step. I mean, you could be very profitable and move forward, but be careful. And I think we're over time, which is, I think, is a good sign, but I want to give Liz a little time for closing remark to cap
Well,
this
I'll
up.
just
No pressure.
yeah, I'll just answer that question. No closing remarks. But I think it's really important to think about coalitions, and that's what we talk about. The climate change research program is closing, so SGC really won't have a future role in research. So we kind of moved that over to the California Climate Change Assessment Group at LCI, Land Use and Climate Innovation, or the former OPR. So that's where that will be housed in our agency at this point. I do think there's not very much state money for research, and there should be. And I think, like, when you look at the climate action grants that went out through UCOP a couple years ago, it was a one-off, right? And that's what we've talked a lot about, is that, there's a lot of things in how the legislature gives you money that isn't conducive to how research is done. You can't build relationships and do really good research in 3 years. And that's just how they write it, because we have this 3 to 5 year kind of process in state government, how we give money out. So I think it's really a matter of, and what we've started doing is meeting with the chancellor's office at CSU and then UCOP, Office of the President, to really talk about how we can all create kind of a coalition that really talks about, especially now with the federal government not having a lot of money, how we can really step up the kind of research we want to see done. And I think that, it's really hard because you guys can't really officially ask for money, I guess, is what I've heard. But what you can do is you can say, there are all of these gaps, and we're not asking you to give us money, but really think about how we can fund research at a larger level. There's a Senate Bill 829 right now out that talks about it, and it has nothing to do with meaningful engagement. It's just like, we need to have somebody to do vaccines because Trump won't do vaccines. I mean, it's really kind of like push back at all the scare tactics that are out there versus really thinking thoughtfully and kind of creating support, really big support, and taking the big groups like EPIC and others to say, let's get together with the people, the leadership, and say, how do we create these coalitions, and really talk to government about how we could look at research and doing long-term research, having a continuing fund for research. Like we say, we're happy to be the ones to administer it, but we don't need to be. We would rather be, in our office, an advisor or somebody who's helping to create the solicitations versus being the one. But we're happy to do it if nobody else wants to. But really kind of getting everyone together to say, here's all of our needs, and this is how we can together, really come together. And as I say, live our program of engagement, right? Let's engage with each other, create coalitions, and do this on a long-term basis rather than funding pot by funding pot. So I guess that's how I would end it. So thanks.
Great. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Follow-up discussion. Very welcome. So think and let it fly, and let's stay in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.